October 1945. 6 months after Hitler's suicide in a Berlin bunker. 5 months after Germany's unconditional surrender. 4 months after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The deadliest war in human history had claimed 70 million lives. Europe lay in ruins. And somewhere in the swamps of Louisiana, a 23-year-old German woman was about to learn that everything she believed was a lie. Her name was Margaret Fisher. She had spent 3 years typing classified Wehrmacht documents while bombs fell on Berlin. She had watched her city burn. She had buried the news of her brother's death on the Eastern Front. She had starved alongside millions of Germans as the Reich collapsed. Now, she stood on American soil, a prisoner of war, waiting to discover what the enemy would do to her. The propaganda had been explicit. Americans would rape. Americans would torture. Americans would strip German women of every shred of dignity before working them to death. Margaret believed this because she had no reason not to. When an American soldier's hand suddenly closed around the collar of her torn uniform, she screamed. She begged. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered in broken English. What happened next would shatter her entire worldview. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not cruelty. It is kindness. Here is what nobody tells you about 1945. Germany did not just lose a war. Germany lost its mind. 12 years of Nazi propaganda had convinced an entire nation that they were the master race, that their enemies were subhuman, that the Reich would last 1,000 years. Then it all collapsed in a matter of months. Soviet troops were executing German prisoners by the tens of thousands. French resistance fighters were taking revenge on any German uniform they could find. Conservative estimates put German POW deaths in Soviet captivity at over 800,000. The message was clear. Surrender meant death. Capture meant suffering. The enemy would treat you exactly as Germany had treated its prisoners. This was the world Margaret Fisher knew. This was the reality she expected. Over 400,000 German prisoners were being held on American soil. They expected brutality because brutality was all they understood. But something unprecedented was happening in American military planning. A small group of officers had proposed an idea so radical that critics called it treason. Instead of punishing German prisoners, they would transform them. Instead of revenge, they would offer rehabilitation. Instead of confirming Nazi propaganda about American barbarism, they would systematically disprove it. The theory was elegant. Germany had spent 12 years telling its people that democracies were weak, that Americans were cruel savages, that only the Nazi way could build a strong nation. What better way to destroy this ideology than to demonstrate the exact opposite? Every hot meal would contradict Nazi teachings. Every act of kindness would plant doubt. Every moment of dignity would chip away at everything prisoners believed. Skeptics were furious. You want to feed Nazis while American families ration? Senators demanded. You want to give the enemy apple pie while our boys come home in coffins? The criticism made emotional sense, but the proponents understood something deeper. Revenge feels satisfying, but changes nothing. Transformation takes patience, but lasts forever. They were betting that kindness could accomplish what bullets never could. Margaret Fisher was nobody special. She was not a general's daughter. She was not a secret resistance fighter. She was just a typist from Berlin who had joined the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Communication Service because refusing meant suspicion, and suspicion meant death. She had operated radios. She had decoded messages. She had typed orders that sent men to die on fronts she would never see. She did her job because that was what you did to survive in Nazi Germany. You kept your head down. You followed orders. You did not ask questions. By October 1945, Margaret weighed barely 100 pounds. Her once tailored uniform hung loose on her skeletal frame. Her hands were cracked and raw from weeks of processing and delousing. She had lost everything that mattered. Her father was missing somewhere in the Soviet occupation zone, probably dead. Her brother's grave lay unmarked on the Eastern Front. Her mother was starving in the ruins of Berlin, trading family heirlooms for scraps of bread. And Margaret herself was now classified as enemy property, transported across an ocean to face whatever horrors awaited. The train ride had taken 3 days. 3 days of pressing her forehead against cold glass, watching America scroll past like a dream she did not understand. The land was green. The cities were intact. There were no bomb craters, no rubble, no skeletal buildings reaching toward empty skies. This was what a country looked like when it had not been destroyed by war. Margaret did not know whether to feel relief or despair. The Louisiana heat hit like a physical force when the train doors opened. October in Germany meant frost and gray skies. Here the air was thick and humid, smelling of pine and something sweet Margaret could not identify. The sun blazed down on rows of whitewashed barracks stretching across flat land. Everything looked alien. Everything looked impossibly alive. There were 43 women on her transport, all former Wehrmacht auxiliaries, all terrified. Some wept quietly. Others stared at nothing with empty eyes. A girl from Hamburg, barely 19, had started shaking and could not stop. Margaret tried to steady her breathing. She had survived bombs falling on Berlin. She had survived the collapse of everything she knew. She would survive this too. Then she felt it, the sudden pressure on her shoulder, the hand closing around her collar. Time fractured. Every warning flooded back. Every whispered story from the prison ships. Every half-heard rumor about what happened to women who fell into enemy hands. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She jerked backward, arms rising defensively, and the words ripped from her throat. "Please don't hurt me." The soldier released her instantly. He stepped back with his hands raised, palms out. He was young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles scattered across sunburned skin. His face showed genuine confusion, then something that looked like hurt. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his Georgia accent stretching the word into 2 syllables. "I ain't going to hurt you. Your uniform's torn. I was just trying to see how bad it is. You're going to freeze when the sun goes down if we don't get you something warmer." Margaret stared at him. Her breath came in short gasps. This was not what she expected. This was not what she had been promised. The soldier kept his hands visible, making himself smaller, less threatening. "My name's Private Walker, Tommy Walker. I'm from Georgia. I'm here to help you ladies get processed and settled. Nobody's going to hurt you. You got my word on that." The processing defied every expectation. The medical examination was conducted by a female doctor who smiled and spoke gently. Captain Reynolds wore an American military uniform, but her eyes were kind behind round spectacles. She checked for lice, examined injuries, listened to heartbeats with professional care. When she pressed fingers against Margaret's visible ribs, her voice softened. "You're malnourished, but you're going to be okay. We're going to get some weight back on you." It was the kindness that broke something inside Margaret. She had expected coldness at best, cruelty at worst. Instead, this American doctor was treating her like a human being, like someone who mattered. After the examination, each woman received civilian clothes donated by local churches. Cotton dresses with small flowers, warm cardigans knitted by volunteer groups, thick socks, and sturdy shoes. When Margaret held the cardigan to her face and smelled lavender soap, she started crying and could not stop. She had not owned anything this nice since before the war. The shower facility had individual stalls with curtains for privacy. The water was hot. The soap actually lathered. Margaret stood under the spray and washed her hair 3 times, watching years of dirt and fear swirl down the drain. When she emerged and caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her hair hung in dark waves around a face that looked younger than it had in years. She was still thin, still marked by starvation, but she was clean. She was alive. She dressed slowly in the donated clothes. The cotton dress was slightly too large, but it was the most comfortable thing she had worn in 2 years. She pulled the cardigan tight around herself and felt something dangerous stir in her chest. Hope. She tried to push it down. Hope was dangerous. Hope would make this harder. The mess hall shattered her completely. The smell of food overwhelmed her before she even reached the serving counter. Real food. Impossible food. She stared at what was being placed on her tray. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into them. Green beans. Thick meatloaf with gravy. A roll with more butter. Coffee with real cream and sugar. And for dessert, apple pie. Margaret carried her tray to a table and sat down, unable to process what was happening. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some crying, some laughing in disbelief. Some eating so fast they made themselves sick. She forced herself to eat slowly. The first bite of meatloaf was so rich it made her dizzy. The potatoes coated her tongue with warmth she had forgotten existed. But it was the apple pie that undid her. One bite, and sweetness exploded across her senses. Cinnamon and sugar and tender apple filling. She closed her eyes and tears ran down her face. In Berlin, her mother was probably eating potato peel soup. Her father, if he was alive, was starving somewhere in Soviet captivity. Her brother was dead. And here she was, a prisoner of war, eating apple pie. The guilt was crushing. The sweetness turned bitter. She set down her fork and pressed her hands against her face, trying to hold back sobs. A hand touched her shoulder gently. Margaret flinched, then looked up. Private Walker was holding a handkerchief. "It's okay to cry, ma'am. I reckon you got a lot to cry about. But you're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. I give you my word." The barracks were simple but clean. Real beds with mattresses and wool blankets. Windows that opened. Bathrooms with running water. Margaret sat on her bunk and felt the absurdity wash over her. This prison was more comfortable than her life in Berlin had been during the final years of the war. That night, a woman named Helga sat down beside her. She was older, maybe 35, with graying hair and tired eyes. "So," Helga said quietly, "this is what the enemy looks like. Hot showers and apple pie." Margaret nodded. "I do not understand it." "Neither do I. But I think they're showing us what we could have had if we had chosen differently. They're showing us what the world looks like when you don't destroy it." Margaret understood then. They were not just prisoners here. They were witnesses. Witnesses to their own nation's failure. Witnesses to the lie they had been sold. Witnesses to a reality they had refused to see. The first weeks established a rhythm. Work assignments that felt more like therapy than punishment. Margaret was assigned to the administrative office because of her language skills. She worked alongside Private Walker, who taught her English idioms and laughed when she confused them. "No, ma'am, it's raining cats and dogs, not raining animals." She was paid a small wage. She could buy chocolate at the canteen. She could buy soap. She could buy a notebook to record the impossible thing happening to her. Educational films showed American democracy in action. Citizens criticizing their own president without arrest. Elections where power transferred peacefully. Freedom of speech as a protected right. Margaret watched and felt her entire worldview cracking apart. But this was only the beginning. The kindness at Camp Ruston would prove harder to survive than any cruelty. Because cruelty confirms what you already believe. Kindness destroys it completely. Letters would soon arrive from Berlin. Letters describing her mother starving in a ruined basement. Letters that would make every bite of food feel like betrayal. And Margaret would face a question she never expected. After experiencing this strange American humanity, after being treated with dignity by the people she was taught to hate, did she even want to go home? In Part 2, we will witness Margaret's psychological transformation deepen. We will see how guilt and gratitude waged war inside her soul. We will hear Private Walker articulate a philosophy so profound it would change her forever. And we will discover what happens when a prisoner realizes her captivity feels more like freedom than anything she knew in Germany. The most dangerous gift the Americans gave was not food or shelter. It was humanity. And once you remember you are human, you can never go back to being anything less. In Part 1, we witnessed Margaret Fisher arrive at Camp Ruston expecting torture and receiving apple pie instead. We watched her scream, "Please don't hurt me," at a soldier who only wanted to fix her torn uniform. We saw kindness begin to crack the walls of Nazi propaganda. But transformation is never simple. The body heals faster than the mind. And Margaret was about to discover that the real enemy was not the Americans. The real enemy was inside her own head. By November 1945, over 400,000 German POWs on American soil were experiencing this same psychological warfare. Not torture, not starvation. Something far more devastating. They were being treated like human beings. And for people raised under 12 years of Nazi ideology, humanity was the most dangerous weapon of all. The letters started arriving in November. Thin paper, heavily censored, but real. Margaret received her first letter from her mother 6 weeks after arriving at Camp Ruston. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "My dearest Margaret, I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not even know if you are alive. We have heard nothing since you were captured. The city is ruins. We live in the basement with 3 other families. There is no heat, no electricity most days. We eat what we can find. Yesterday your Aunt Gertrude traded her wedding ring for half a loaf of bread. Your father is still missing. We pray he is alive somewhere in the Soviet zone, but we fear the worst. If you are receiving this, if you are safe, I thank God. Do not worry about us. We will survive. We always do. Know that I love you. Know that I am proud of you. Come home to us when you can. Your loving mother." Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it under her pillow. That night, she could not eat dinner. The meatloaf and mashed potatoes sat untouched, while somewhere in Berlin, her mother starved. The guilt became a physical weight in her chest. How could she swallow food when her family had nothing? How could she enjoy hot showers while her mother froze in a basement? How could she laugh at Private Walker's jokes while her nation crumbled into ash? She was not alone in this torment. All around her, women were receiving similar letters, stories of devastation, starvation, desperation. The contrast was unbearable. They were gaining weight while their families withered. They were learning English while their mothers forgot how to hope. They were sleeping in clean beds while their fathers died in Soviet labor camps. Some women stopped eating entirely. Others refused to participate in camp activities. A few retreated into silence, unable to reconcile the impossible contradiction of their existence. Margaret began pushing food around her plate. If her mother was hungry, she should be hungry too. If her people were suffering, she should suffer with them. This was the only logic that made sense. This was the only way to remain loyal to a nation that had already destroyed itself. Private Walker noticed within days. He always noticed. "Miss Fisher," he said one afternoon as she pushed her lunch tray away barely touched. "You need to eat. You're getting thin again." "My mother is hungry," Margaret replied quietly. "I got letter. She has no food. How can I eat when she is starving?" Private Walker was silent for a moment. Then he sat down across from her. "Ma'am, I understand. I do. But you starving yourself ain't going to feed your mama. It's just going to make 2 people hungry instead of 1. You need to stay strong so when this war is finally over, when you can go home, you'll be healthy enough to help her. You see what I'm saying?" Margaret looked at this young American soldier with his kind eyes and slow drawl. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part screamed that believing him was betrayal. "It is hard," she whispered, "to be treated so well by the enemy. Harder than being treated badly would be." "I reckon that's true," Private Walker said. Hate's easier than kindness. Kindness makes you think, makes you question. But ma'am, we ain't your enemy. We never were. We were fighting a war against your leaders, not against you. You were just caught in the middle, same as a lot of folks. This was the argument Margaret could not answer. The propaganda had been so clear. Americans were monsters. Americans were subhuman barbarians who would destroy everything German. But the Americans had given her soap that smelled like lavender. They had given her apple pie. They had given her a soldier who noticed when she stopped eating and sat down to make sure she was okay. Which reality was true? The propaganda she had believed for 12 years, or the kindness she was experiencing every single day? The cognitive dissonance was tearing her apart. She needed answers. She needed to understand how the world actually worked. And the Americans, whether they intended it or not, were about to provide exactly that. The educational films started in January. Twice a week, the women gathered in the recreation hall to watch American documentaries. Not propaganda, though many prisoners approached them with suspicion. These were films about American history, government, and daily life. Margaret watched footage of the American Revolution. She learned about the Constitution. She saw citizens openly criticizing their president without fear of arrest. She watched elections where power transferred peacefully between opposing parties. She observed factories where workers had unions and rights. She saw newspapers printing whatever they wanted without government censorship. It was a vision of a world she had never imagined possible. A world where power was limited, where dissent was tolerated, where individual dignity mattered more than collective glory. After one film about the Bill of Rights, Private Walker asked if anyone had questions. Margaret raised her hand hesitantly. "This freedom of speech," she said carefully. "You are saying people can criticize, the government can say the president is wrong, and nothing happens to them." "That's right, ma'am. That's one of our most important freedoms. The government can't punish you for speaking your mind. You can disagree with the president, with Congress, with any elected official. You can write letters to newspapers. You can protest in the streets. As long as you ain't hurting anybody or inciting violence, you're free to say what you think." Margaret sat back stunned. In Germany, criticizing the Führer meant death. Questioning the party line meant imprisonment, or worse. The idea that a government would protect its citizens' right to disagree was almost incomprehensible. "But how does government work if people are always disagreeing?" she asked. Private Walker smiled. "Well, ma'am, it ain't always pretty. It's messy and loud, and sometimes it takes forever to get anything done. But that's the point. When everybody gets a say, when power is spread out instead of concentrated in one person or one party, it's harder for things to go real wrong. It ain't perfect. Lord knows we got our problems, but it's a whole lot better than the alternative." That night, Margaret wrote in her diary, "They have shown me a different way. A way where people matter more than nations. Where individuals have worth beyond their usefulness to the state. Where disagreement is not treason, but the foundation of progress. I do not know if I can ever go back to believing what I believed before. I do not know if I want to." The transformation was accelerating now. Each film chipped away at another piece of Nazi ideology. Each conversation with Private Walker planted another seed of doubt. Each act of kindness reinforced what she was learning. Democracy was not weakness. Freedom was not chaos. Individual dignity was not selfishness. Everything she had been taught was wrong. But accepting this truth meant accepting something far more painful. It meant accepting that her brother had died for nothing. It meant accepting that her father had suffered for a lie. It meant accepting that the entire war, every death, every destroyed city, every starving child, had been completely and utterly pointless. The Reich had promised glory and delivered only ashes. The Führer had promised a 1,000-year empire and left behind a graveyard. Germany had sacrificed everything for an ideology built on hatred and lies, and Margaret had believed it. She had typed orders that sent men to die. She had served a machine of destruction without question. She was not innocent, None of them were innocent. The moment of true transformation came in late February. Margaret was working in the administrative office when she overheard two American officers talking. "How are the German women settling in?" one asked. "Better than expected. They're good workers, polite. A few are even learning English pretty well. That Fisher girl, the one from Berlin, she's real sharp. Could probably work as a translator if we needed one." "Any trouble from them?" "None worth mentioning. They're just women who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. Most of them are just trying to survive same as anybody else." Margaret stood frozen at the filing cabinet. Those words echoed in her head. Just women who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. That was how they saw her. Not as a Nazi, not as an enemy, not as someone to be punished or humiliated. Just as a woman who had been swept up in the machinery of war and deposited here trying to make sense of a world turned upside down. They saw her as human. Fully, completely, undeniably human. Not because of what she had done or failed to do. Not because of her nationality or her politics. Simply because she was a person, and persons had inherent worth. It was the most radical act of compassion she had ever experienced. That afternoon, she found Private Walker on a bench outside reading a letter from home. "Private Walker, may I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. What's on your mind?" "Why? Why do you treat us this way? We are enemy. We worked for Wehrmacht. We are German. Why do you give us food and clothes and kindness? Why do you see us as people?" Private Walker was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Because that's what you are, ma'am. People. The war is over. Whatever side you were on, whatever you did or didn't do, it's done now. And what I see when I look at you ladies ain't enemies. I see women who lost their homes, their families, their whole world. I see people who need help. And where I come from, when somebody needs help, you help them. It's that simple." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "It is not simple. It is the most complicated thing I have ever experienced. It would be easier if you hated us." "I reckon that's true," Private Walker said. "Hate's a lot simpler than compassion. But here's the thing, Miss Fisher. If we treat you the way you were taught to expect with cruelty and degradation, then we become the monsters you were told we were. But if we treat you with decency, if we show you that there's another way, then maybe, just maybe, you'll go home someday and help build something better than what came before. That's the hope anyway." Margaret stared at this simple farm boy from Georgia, who had somehow articulated the most profound political philosophy she had ever heard. The Americans were not being kind because it was easy. They were being kind because it was hard, because it was revolutionary, because it was the only way to break the cycle of violence and hatred that had consumed the world. They were teaching by example. And the lesson was this: humanity could survive hatred, but only if someone chose to be human first. By March, the transformation was complete. Margaret had gained 20 pounds. Her face was healthy again. Her hair shone in the sunlight. But more importantly, something had shifted deep inside her. The woman who had believed in the glory of the Reich was gone. The woman who had typed Wehrmacht orders without question no longer existed. In her place was someone new, someone uncertain, someone struggling to understand what she believed now that all her old certainties had crumbled. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in a window and stopped. The woman looking back was healthy, clean dressed in a simple cotton dress. She looked like someone who belonged here. She looked American. The realization hit like a physical blow. She had become the thing she was supposed to hate. She had absorbed the enemy's values. She had adopted their way of seeing the world. She had internalized their belief in individual dignity and democratic ideals. She had been transformed not by force, but by kindness. Not by propaganda, but by lived experience. The Americans had not broken her. They had rebuilt her. And the most terrifying part was that she did not want to go back. She did not want to return to the ruins of Germany. She did not want the hunger and cold and desperate struggle. She did not want to go back to a world where questioning authority meant death and individual worth was measured only by usefulness to the state. She wanted to stay here, in this strange prison that felt more like freedom than any life she had known in Germany. That evening she sat with Helga and spoke the truth aloud for the first time. "I do not want to go home. Is that terrible? I do not want to leave my prison." Helga looked at her with eyes that held the same shame, the same complicated grief. "Neither do I. God forgive me, but neither do I." But word was coming. Repatriation would begin soon. The war had been over for nearly a year. Germany was stabilizing under Allied occupation. It was time for the prisoners to go home. And Margaret would have to face the question she had been avoiding. After everything she had experienced, after all the kindness and dignity and transformation, what kind of person would she become? What would she do with the humanity the Americans had given back to her? In Part 3, we will witness Margaret's final weeks at Camp Ruston. We will see Private Walker give her a gift she will carry for the rest of her life. We will watch her board the ship back to Germany, carrying within her the seeds of a new way of thinking. And we will discover what happens when a transformed woman returns to a destroyed nation. The Americans had bet that kindness could accomplish what cruelty never could. They had bet that treating prisoners with dignity would create ambassadors for democracy. Margaret Fisher was about to prove them right. But first, she would have to say goodbye to the enemy who had saved her soul. In Part 1, Margaret Fisher arrived at Camp Ruston, expecting torture, and received apple pie instead. In Part 2, we watched her transformation deepen as kindness systematically destroyed 12 years of Nazi propaganda. Letters from her starving mother created unbearable guilt. Educational films revealed a world where freedom was not weakness. Private Walker articulated a philosophy so simple yet so profound that it rewrote everything she believed. Now the transformation was complete. Margaret Fisher was no longer the woman who had typed Wehrmacht orders in Berlin. She was someone new, someone who believed in individual dignity, someone who questioned authority, someone who had been rebuilt by enemy kindness. But transformation inside a prison camp was one thing. Taking that transformation home to a destroyed nation was something else entirely. In April 1946, word came that repatriation would begin. The war had been over for nearly a year. Germany was stabilizing under Allied occupation. It was time for the prisoners to go home, and Margaret would have to answer the question she had been avoiding. What happens when a changed person returns to an unchanged world? The news spread through the barracks like ice water. Some women wept with joy, desperate to see families they had not touched in years. Others received the announcement in numb silence, unable to process what it meant. Margaret sat on her bunk staring at the letter informing her of her scheduled departure and felt nothing but fear. She had spent 18 months being transformed. 18 months learning that everything she believed was wrong. 18 months absorbing American values, American ideas, American ways of seeing the world. Now she would return to Germany carrying these foreign seeds inside her. How would her mother react? How would her neighbors respond? How would a nation still reeling from total defeat receive a woman who had been fundamentally changed by the enemy? The propaganda had worked both ways. Germans had been taught that Americans were monsters, but Germans had also been taught that anyone who sympathized with the enemy was a traitor. Margaret was about to test both beliefs simultaneously. The final weeks at Camp Ruston took on a bittersweet quality. Women who had become friends began saying goodbye, knowing they might never see each other again. Some exchanged addresses promising to write. Others simply embraced in silence words inadequate for what they had shared. Margaret found herself memorizing everything. The smell of coffee in the morning. The sound of American radio playing in the recreation hall. The way sunlight fell through the mess hall windows. The impossible comfort of a clean bed and regular meals. She was storing these memories like provisions for a journey into unknown territory. Helga, her closest friend, was scheduled to leave 2 weeks before Margaret. Their final conversation was quiet and honest. "I am afraid Helga admitted. Not of the journey, not of the ruins. I am afraid of who I have become. I am afraid my family will not recognize me. Margaret understood completely. We are not the same women who were captured, she said. We have been transformed. The question is whether transformation can survive going home. Helga embraced her tightly. Write to me. Whatever happens, write to me. We need to remember what we learned here. They both knew that memory would be their greatest weapon and their heaviest burden. Private Walker found Margaret in the administrative office 3 days before her scheduled departure. She was organizing files she would never touch again, trying to stay busy, trying not to think about what was coming. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work before speaking. Miss Fisher, got a minute? Margaret looked up. 18 months of working together had created something she did not have words for. Not romance. Not exactly friendship. Something deeper. He had been her teacher, her guide, her window into a world she never knew existed. And now she would never see him again. Of course, Private Walker. He sat down across from her, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. I wanted to give you something. For the journey. And for after. Margaret took the package with trembling hands. Inside was a small American flag, carefully folded. A collection of photographs from her time at the camp. And a letter written in his careful, sprawling handwriting. Read it later, he said. When you're on the ship. Or when you get home. Whenever you need to remember. Margaret clutched the package to her chest. Thank you for everything. I do not have words for what you have given me. You don't need words, ma'am. You just need to remember. Remember that people are people no matter where they're from. Remember that kindness is stronger than hate. Remember that you matter not because of what you can do for your country, but just because you're you. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. This farm boy from Georgia, with his simple words and enormous heart, had changed her more than any philosopher or teacher ever could. He had shown her humanity by being human. He had proven that the enemy was not a monster by treating her like a person. Everything she would become, everything she would teach her children, everything she would contribute to rebuilding Germany would trace back to this moment, to this man, to this impossible kindness. I will never forget, she whispered. I give you my word. Private Walker smiled that same genuine expression she had seen on the platform 18 months ago when he had tried to fix her torn uniform. I know you won't, Miss Fisher. Now go home and build something better. That's all any of us can do. The morning of departure was gray and drizzling, the sky weeping in a way that felt appropriate. Women gathered in the processing yard wearing the clothes they would take home. Practical dresses. Warm coats donated by American families. Sturdy shoes. Each carried a small suitcase packed with essentials and the few personal items they had acquired during captivity. Margaret stood alone, holding the package from Private Walker, watching the buses that would take them to the port. Around her, other women embraced American soldiers who had guarded them, thanking the cooks and doctors who had made their captivity bearable. It was the strangest farewell imaginable. Prisoners saying goodbye to prison. Captives thanking their captors. Enemies parting as something close to friends. Private Walker approached one last time. Without speaking, he pulled her into a brief, careful embrace. The kind you might give a sister. You take care now, he said. And remember what I told you. You matter. Don't you forget that. I will not forget. I will never forget. She climbed onto the bus. As it pulled away from Camp Ruston, she turned in her seat, watching the barracks and the mess hall and the administrative building grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. She was going home, but she was also leaving home, and that contradiction would stay with her for the rest of her life. The ship crossing took 2 weeks. Margaret spent most of it on deck, staring at the gray Atlantic, reading and rereading Private Walker's letter. Dear Miss Fisher, I wanted to give you something to remember your time here, though I reckon you won't need help remembering. You've been one of the best workers we've had, And more than that, you've been a good person to know. I hope you find your family well and that Germany can heal from all this devastation. Don't forget what you learned here. Not the English, though you got real good at that, but the bigger things. That people are people, no matter where they're from. That kindness is stronger than hate. That you matter not because of what you can do for your country, but just because you're you. If you ever need anything, or if you ever want to write, my address is on the back of this letter. I mean that. You're not my enemy. You never were. You're just someone who got caught up in something terrible and came out the other side. That makes you pretty strong in my book. Take care of yourself, Miss Fisher. And remember, you're worth saving. Your friend, Private Tommy Walker. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her diary next to the photograph of her family from before the war. 2 different worlds. 2 different versions of herself, held together by paper and memory. The ship docked in Hamburg in late May 1946. Nothing could have prepared Margaret for what she saw. The city was destroyed. Not damaged. Not wounded. Destroyed. Mountains of rubble stretched in every direction. Skeletal buildings reached toward empty skies. The streets were filled with people who looked like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, moving through the ruins as if sleepwalking. The smell hit next. Dust. Rot. Something chemical and burning. The sweet, humid air of Louisiana seemed like a dream from another lifetime. This was Germany now. This was home. Margaret walked through the streets of Hamburg toward the train station, stepping over debris, avoiding the eyes of people who stared at her healthy face and clean clothes with something between envy and suspicion. She looked too healthy. She looked too clean. She looked like someone who had been treated well while everyone else suffered. The guilt was crushing. The train to Berlin took 14 hours. There was no schedule. Trains ran when they ran. Passengers sat wherever they could find space, some on seats, some on floors, some standing for hours. Margaret found a corner and pressed herself into it, making herself as small as possible, clutching her suitcase and Private Walker's package like lifelines. Around her, conversations swirled in German. Complaints about food shortages. Rumors about the occupation. Bitter comments about the Allies who had destroyed their country. Someone muttered about collaborators who had done too well under enemy captivity. Margaret said nothing. She understood that she was now a stranger in her own land. When she finally reached Berlin, she barely recognized the city where she had grown up. The landmarks were gone. The streets were rubble. The apartment building where her family had lived was half collapsed, the upper floors blown away by bombs. She stood staring at the ruins, trying to reconcile memory with reality, until an old woman approached her. "Margaret, is that you?" It was her neighbor, Frau Hoffmann, aged 20 years in the two since Margaret had last seen her. "Frau Hoffmann, yes, it is me. I am home." "Your mother is alive. She lives in the basement with the Schmidts. Go to her. She has been praying for you every day." Margaret found her mother in a dark basement room lit by a single candle. The woman who looked up from a thin mattress was almost unrecognizable, skeletal, gray, ancient. But when she saw Margaret, something ignited in her eyes. My daughter is alive." They embraced, and Margaret felt bones where there should have been flesh. Her mother weighed perhaps 80 pounds. She smelled of hunger and cold and the particular desperation of people who have survived too much. "Mama, I am home. I am here." "You look healthy," her mother said, pulling back to study her face. "You look like you ate well." There was no accusation in her voice, just observation, just the simple acknowledgement that Margaret had survived differently than those who stayed behind. "The Americans treated us well," Margaret said carefully. "Better than we expected, better than we deserved." Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Good. That is good. At least someone in this family did not starve." The reunion was joyful and painful simultaneously. Margaret learned that her father had died in Soviet captivity 3 months earlier. The news had come through the Red Cross. A single typed sentence that closed that chapter forever. She learned that Aunt Gertrude had died of influenza during the winter, that her cousin Heinrich had lost both legs on the Eastern Front and now begged on street corners, that Germany was a nation of widows and orphans and broken men. But she also saw something else. She saw Germans beginning to rebuild, clearing rubble with bare hands, organizing food distribution, creating order from chaos. The same determination that had built the Wehrmacht was now being channeled into survival, and Margaret realized she had something to contribute. She had seen another way. She had been shown what democracy looked like. She had learned that kindness could be stronger than hate. She began slowly, teaching English to neighborhood children in exchange for vegetables and firewood, helping organize women's groups focused on reconstruction and education, sharing carefully and quietly what she had learned about individual rights and democratic principles. Not everyone was receptive. Some accused her of being corrupted by the enemy. Some called her naive or worse. But others listened. Others wanted to understand how a defeated nation could rebuild itself differently. Others were hungry for alternatives to the ideology that had destroyed them. She wrote to Private Walker once a year every Christmas, telling him about her life, about Germany's slow recovery, about the democracy taking root in the western zones. He always wrote back. News about his farm in Georgia, his sister Betty, who had become a teacher, his own marriage and children, the America that continued to evolve and struggle and grow. Their correspondence lasted 40 years. Two people from opposite sides of a terrible war connected by kindness that transcended borders and history. Years later, when Margaret had children of her own, she told them the story of her captivity. Not with shame, with complicated gratitude. The war taught me to hate, she explained. But captivity taught me to be human again. The Americans showed me that the enemy is never the person standing in front of you. The real enemy is the ideology that makes you forget that person's humanity. And the only way to defeat that enemy is to remember always that every person matters. Every life has worth, even especially the lives of those we are told to hate. Private Tommy Walker never knew how completely he had changed Margaret Fisher's life. He thought he was just being decent, just treating a frightened prisoner the way any person should. But his simple acts of kindness created ripple effects he could never have imagined. Through Margaret to her children, through her children to their communities, through communities to a new Germany slowly learning to see the world differently. The American experiment at Camp Rustin and dozens of camps like it had proven something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Kindness could accomplish what cruelty never could. Treating prisoners with dignity could transform enemies into ambassadors. Showing humanity could destroy ideology more effectively than any propaganda. Of the 400,000 German POWs held on American soil, the vast majority returned home changed. Not broken, not bitter, changed. They carried with them memories of hot meals and fair treatment and guards who saw them as human beings. They told their families and their neighbors and their children what they had experienced. And those stories, millions of individual testimonies to American decency, helped rebuild a nation that had been taught to see America as the enemy. But this story has one final chapter. What happened to the broader experiment? What happened to the philosophy that transformed Margaret Fisher and thousands like her? And what lessons does this forgotten moment in history hold for our world today? In Part 4, we will discover the legacy of kindness as a weapon of war. We will see how the Camp Rustin approach influenced American policy for generations. We will learn what happened to Private Tommy Walker and Margaret Fisher in the decades that followed. And we will confront the most important question of all. In a world that still teaches us to hate, can we choose to be human first? The answer may surprise you. Stay with me. The conclusion is coming. In Part 1, Margaret Fisher arrived at Camp Rustin expecting torture and received apple pie instead. In Part 2, we watched kindness systematically destroy 12 years of Nazi propaganda inside her mind. In Part 3, we followed her journey home to a destroyed Germany, carrying seeds of democracy planted by a farm boy from Georgia. Over 400,000 German prisoners experienced this same transformation on American soil. The experiment had worked. Kindness had accomplished what cruelty never could. But what happened next? What became of Private Tommy Walker, the soldier who grabbed a frightened woman's collar to fix her torn uniform and accidentally changed her entire worldview? What became of Margaret Fisher, the typist who returned to Berlin carrying American values in her heart? And what became of the philosophy that treated enemies as future friends? This story has one final chapter. A chapter about legacy. A chapter about what happens when kindness ripples outward across decades. A chapter that proves the most powerful weapon in human history is not destruction, it is transformation. Private Tommy Walker returned to Georgia in the summer of 1946, 3 months after Margaret Fisher boarded her ship to Hamburg. He went back to his family's farm outside Savannah, married his high school sweetheart in 1948, and raised 4 children in the same white farmhouse where he had grown up. He never talked much about the war. When his children asked, he would say only that he had been stationed stateside working with German prisoners, nothing exciting. He did not mention that he had helped transform enemies into ambassadors. He did not mention the thousands of small kindnesses that had chipped away at Nazi ideology. He did not mention Margaret Fisher or the other women whose lives he had changed. That was not how Tommy Walker saw the world. He had simply done what decent people do. He had treated frightened women like human beings. He had offered handkerchiefs to crying prisoners. He had explained American democracy to people who had never imagined such freedom existed. These were not heroic acts in his mind. They were just basic decency. But Margaret never forgot. Every Christmas for 40 years, a letter arrived at the Walker farm. Thin blue airmail envelopes with German stamps addressed in careful handwriting that improved year by year. Margaret wrote about rebuilding Berlin, about teaching English to neighborhood children, about marrying a carpenter named Hans who had lost his arm on the Eastern Front, about her daughter Ingrid, born in 1952, and her son Thomas, named after a Georgia farm boy who had once shown her what humanity looked like. Tommy Walker wrote back every time. He told her about his children growing up, about his daughter Betty becoming a nurse like she always wanted, about Georgia summers and American elections, and the slow evolution of a country still learning to live up to its own ideals. 2 people from opposite sides of a terrible war, connected by kindness that transcended borders and ideology and everything they had been taught to believe. When Tommy Walker died in 1987 at age 67, Margaret received the news from his widow. She sat in her apartment in Berlin, now a grandmother herself, and wept for hours. Not just for the man she had lost, but for everything he represented. For the philosophy he had embodied without ever calling it a philosophy. For the simple truth he had demonstrated every single day at Camp Ruston. That people are people. That kindness is stronger than hate. That every human being has worth. At his funeral in Georgia, which Margaret could not attend, his children finally learned the full story. Letters were read. Photographs were shared. A family discovered that their quiet father had been part of something unprecedented in the history of warfare. He had been a soldier in an army of kindness, and he had won a victory that no bomb or bullet could ever achieve. But the true legacy of Tommy Walker and Camp Ruston extended far beyond one farm in Georgia and one apartment in Berlin. The American approach to German POWs became a case study in military psychology. After the war, researchers analyzed what had happened in camps across the United States. The results were staggering. Of the approximately 400,000 German prisoners held on American soil, the overwhelming majority returned home with fundamentally changed attitudes toward democracy and American values. Surveys conducted in the late 1940s showed that former POWs were significantly more likely to support democratic institutions than Germans who had remained in Europe. They were more likely to participate in elections. more likely to reject authoritarian ideology, more likely to believe in individual rights and freedoms. The experiment had worked at scale. Kindness had transformed an entire generation of potential enemies into allies. The philosophy was formalized and studied. Military academies incorporated lessons about the psychological impact of humane treatment. The Geneva Conventions, strengthened after World War II, drew partly on the American POW experience. The principle that prisoners should be treated with dignity was not just ethical, it was strategic. It created future friends instead of future enemies. The approach influenced American policy in Korea, where POW treatment became a propaganda battleground. It shaped thinking about Vietnam, where the failure to apply these lessons created lasting bitterness. It continues to inform military doctrine today, where counterinsurgency experts emphasize winning hearts and minds rather than simply destroying bodies. But the deepest impact was not institutional. It was personal. Margaret Fisher spent the rest of her life teaching what she had learned. She worked with women's groups in Berlin, helping to rebuild civil society from the ruins of fascism. She taught her children about democracy, about individual rights, about the importance of questioning authority. When Ingrid grew up and had children of her own, she passed these values to the next generation. And when Thomas, named for a Georgia farm boy, became a teacher himself, he taught his students about a time when enemies chose to be human instead of hateful. The ripples spread outward. From Margaret to her family, from her family to their communities, from communities to a new Germany that became one of the strongest democracies in the world. The American experiment at Camp Rustin and camps like it had planted seeds that grew into forests. Researchers estimate that the 400,000 German POWs who returned home influenced millions of Germans through their personal testimonies. Each former prisoner told their story to family members, neighbors, colleagues. Each story contradicted Nazi propaganda. Each act of remembered kindness weakened the ideology that had nearly destroyed the world. By the time Germany reunified in 1990, the generation that had experienced American captivity was aging, but their influence remained. Their children and grandchildren had absorbed the lessons. Democracy was not weakness. Individual rights were not selfishness. The enemy was not always a monster. Sometimes the enemy was just a person waiting to be shown a better way. What can we learn from this forgotten chapter of history? The lesson is not about military strategy or political philosophy. The lesson is about choice. Every day, in every interaction, we choose how to treat the people around us. We can choose suspicion or trust. We can choose cruelty or kindness. We can choose to see enemies or fellow human beings. The Americans at Camp Rustin made a choice that seemed insane to their critics. They chose to treat prisoners with dignity when every instinct demanded revenge. They chose to demonstrate democracy instead of just preaching it. They chose to believe that transformation was possible, even for people raised under 12 years of Nazi propaganda. And they were right. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Marshall Plan chose to rebuild former enemies instead of punishing them, creating decades of prosperity and alliance. Nelson Mandela chose reconciliation over retribution, preventing a civil war in South Africa. The European Union chose integration over isolation, ensuring that nations that had fought for centuries would never fight again. In each case, the choice to be humane seemed naive or even dangerous to critics. In each case, that choice proved more powerful than any weapon. Because weapons can destroy enemies, but only kindness can transform them. The military applications are obvious, but the personal applications may be even more important. Every one of us encounters people we are taught to hate. Political opponents, cultural enemies, those who believe differently, or look differently, or live differently. And every one of us faces the same choice that Private Tommy Walker faced on that platform in Louisiana. We can confirm what they expect. We can be the monsters they were told we would be. Or we can surprise them with humanity. We can offer a handkerchief to someone who is crying. We can explain instead of attack. We can treat people as individuals rather than categories. The choice is always ours. And now there is one final detail that most people do not know. When researchers in the 1990s began examining the Camp Rustin records in depth, they discovered something remarkable. The program had been even more intentional than previously understood. Documents showed that American military planners had specifically designed the POW experience as a re-education program. They had calculated the psychological impact of every meal, every film, every interaction. The kindness was genuine, but it was also strategic. Military leaders had understood that destroying Nazi ideology required more than military victory. It required showing Germans what the alternative looked like. Every hot meal was a lesson in abundance. Every fair treatment was a lesson in justice. Every act of kindness was a bullet fired directly at the foundations of fascism. Private Tommy Walker did not know he was part of a calculated psychological operation. He thought he was just being decent. But that was exactly the point. The program worked because the kindness was real. You cannot fake humanity. You cannot pretend to see someone as a person. Either you believe in human dignity or you do not. The Americans who staffed the POW camps believed. And that belief changed history. Margaret Fisher died in 2003 at age 81, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, in the same Berlin where she had once typed Wehrmacht orders. In her final years, she gave interviews to historians researching the American POW program. She told her story again and again, hoping someone would listen. Hoping someone would understand what she had learned in a Louisiana prison camp 60 years earlier. The Americans showed me that the enemy is never the person standing in front of you, she said in one of her last interviews. The real enemy is the ideology that makes you forget that person's humanity. And the only way to defeat that enemy is to remember always that every person matters. Every life has worth. Even the lives of those we are told to hate. She was buried with Private Walker's letter in her pocket. The thin paper had been folded and unfolded so many times over 50 years that it was nearly transparent. But the words were still legible. You're not my enemy. You never were. You're just someone who got caught up in something terrible and came out the other side. Take care of yourself, Miss Fisher, and remember, you're worth saving. From a terrified prisoner begging not to be hurt to a grandmother who helped rebuild a nation. From a farm boy fixing a torn uniform to a legacy that shaped history. From an experiment in kindness that seemed insane to a transformation that saved countless lives. This is what Private Tommy Walker taught without ever knowing he was teaching. This is what Margaret Fisher learned without ever expecting to learn. This is what 400,000 German prisoners carried home in their hearts. Kindness is not weakness. Humanity is not naive. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your enemy is show them they are worth saving. If you know stories like this, forgotten moments of history that deserve to be remembered, share them in the comments below. If this video moved you, hit subscribe and the notification bell to discover more chapters of World War II that nobody talks about. There are hundreds of these stories, thousands of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, each one proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can be found. Private Tommy Walker never received a medal for what he did. His name appears in no history books. He thought he was just doing his job. But in a world that taught him to hate, he chose to be human instead. And that single choice, multiplied by thousands of soldiers at hundreds of camps, helped win something more important than any battle. It helped win the peace. Remember that the next time someone tells you kindness is weak. Remember that the next time you face someone you are supposed to hate. Remember that the most dangerous weapon in human history is not a bomb or a bullet or a tank. It is a simple question asked to every human being in every moment of every day. Will you choose hate or will you choose humanity? Private Tommy Walker made his choice. Margaret Fisher made hers. Now the choice is yours.